Land corruption may be defined as the abuse of power to claim, register, control, or transact land in bad faith. And I started working on this because I've spent the last 20 years as a land rights lawyer protecting indigenous land rights all around the world. And I was working with colleagues to help communities to document and map and seek titles or deeds for their lands so that they could not be stolen by corrupt government officials and investors. And the more I did the work, the more I saw that almost nothing is a barrier to corrupt government officials who want to steal land. And I noticed that almost nobody was working on this or writing about it or talking about it. And I got very angry and I wanted to really understand why and what was possible. So this presentation comes out of a paper I wrote for the United Nations. And I want to say in advance that there is so much fear around this topic that I wasn't allowed to give any examples in the paper that I wrote. I had to only talk vaguely because the United Nations was afraid that if we named any countries, they would stop the publication from even coming out. So that's the kind of power we're talking about and the kind of fear we're talking about. So this presentation focuses on grand corruption or political corruption. And what is this? This is land corruption perpetrated by high-level government actors and their family members. This presentation focuses on how national elites and high-level government actors and their associates and their families leverage their power and wealth using influence, pressure, fear, intimidation, and threats to corruptly and illegally claim lands to which families and communities have legitimate tenure rights. Some examples of this are government actors who buy land at low prices in an area where they know that future government infrastructure will soon be built, and therefore the value of the land will rise so they can make a profit. Or accepting bribes to lose public record of a family's land ownership and then registering that family's land in another person's name, or changing titles to reflect false realities. In its most extreme form, second slide. In its most extreme form, land corruption is the result of state capture by elites. Candidates run for office precisely to get the state power to access vast areas of land. And once in power, they can then illegally transfer state or public lands to themselves or their associates, draft and implement land laws and policies that weaken the land rights of indigenous peoples and other marginalized groups, making it easier to dispossess them from their lands, rezone lands to open them up for corporate investments they have a private stake in, or misuse state compulsory acquisition powers to grab land for their investments. You know, I was just reading in the newspaper today about the West Bank, how the state of Israel just changes the laws so it can take Palestinian lands. And that is a very huge example of land corruption, where the state has captured all the power to take whatever land it wants. And that's an extreme example. Land corruption usually involves elites stealing from the poorest and most marginalized members of society, for whom land is not only their home, but their source of livelihood, food and water security, connection to culture and community and ancestry and spirituality. Such actions, which may involve fencing off entire forests, restricting access to water sources, bulldozing whole communities, setting fires to people's houses, are severe human rights abuses, yet they are often carried out by government officials and their associates with total impunity. Land corruption often leaves its victims homeless, destitute, heartbroken, and enraged. Yet the people whose lands have been taken may be too afraid to challenge the injustice or feel unable to seek judicial remedy within a court system which is controlled and corrupted by the same high-level government officials. Next slide, third slide. Unlike financial corruption, which involves the quiet transfer of funds from one bank account or the state into someone else's bank account, land corruption, once it's done, requires force to actually maintain. It's not only the grabbing of the land in the first place. Afterwards, the corporations, elites, and government officials who have taken that land in bad faith must then corrupt other government institutions to defend it, at times leveraging the local police, the army, the courts, land administration officials, and other state institutions to guard the land, threaten and intimidate the owners, formalize and register the land as theirs, or help them avoid legal prosecution. It becomes an action that requires so many different parts of the state to keep land that has been grabbed in the wrong hands. And the use of state violence against people who are fighting against the illegal dispossession of their lands or the land grabs has become prevalent. In 2019 alone, Global Witness reported 37 murders of land rights activists linked to state forces directly. And it is likely that that number is even higher and is growing higher every year. Although it is unreported and difficult to measure, land corruption is on the rise. As the population increases and as climate change is leading to a decreased soil fertility and rainfall, it means that fertile lands are becoming more scarce and are increasing sharply in value. And these are the lands that are often owned, used, and held by indigenous peoples and local communities whose ancestors have been living and working on the land for generations. As arable land and fertile land and water become more scarce, those with money, power, and influence are likely to resort to increasing levels of violence and coercion to claim lands owned by families and communities. Resource and water-rich lands will particularly come under threat. And the carbon markets, the RED programs, will exacerbate the land corruption as they generate funding for landowners. The more that forests are worth financially, the more those with power will claim them illegally. Fifth slide. And you know what? Nothing or almost nothing is being done at the national level to address land corruption by elites. They have complete impunity. They are not accountable to anybody. Because high-level land corruption is perpetuated by high-ranking elites, addressing land corruption is ultimately a matter of political will. And if individuals at the highest levels of power have a vested interest in continuing corrupt practices, then there is no law, no set of guidelines, or even national-level criminal prosecutions leading to the incarceration of a few individuals that will make a difference in reducing land corruption. In such contexts, one-off initiatives simply will not address the structural factors that help land corruption flourish. If some very high-level family is stealing lands, like the president's family or the president's, or the prime minister's family or anyone the head of the parliament, you name it, which I guess is the prime minister, high-level parliamentary people, if they're grabbing land, it's very, very, very hard to stop them. And while many countries have good anti-corruption laws in place, those laws are rarely applied to land corruption by national elites. They've got good financial corruption because it's easy to stop the flow of money, but it's very hard to stop land grabbing by people who have power. When corruption stems from the highest levels of power, government-led efforts are not sufficient. And if the courts are corrupted, pursuing litigation is not the best solution. Sixth slide. So how do we address land corruption? I don't have great news. Only efforts that squeeze the state into a position of unavoidable discomfort, public shame, or financial difficulty will have any chance of impacting leaders' political will to change. You must use the combined efforts of national citizens who are exerting pressure from below and international actors exerting pressure from above. People must protest in huge numbers so no one can be singled out, as it's too dangerous. And from above, international agencies or banks like the World Bank or the Latin American Development Bank, they must push governments to actively prosecute land corruption and international oversight and certification boards. They should rigorously investigate reports of land corruption. And most of all, the media has to shine a light on land corruption, because you have to have public shame and discomfort for anyone to do anything about it. Next slide. So I looked a lot. I'm always looking for examples of land corruption in the media, and it's almost never in the media. So here we have two slides. This one on the left is a picture of Kenyan school children. In Kenya, the people in government are in government just to steal land, and there's no more land left to steal. So this one government official tried to steal the playground next to their children's school, and he fenced it off. And the little children started protesting, saying, "Give us back our playground, give us back our schoolyard." And the police tear gassed the children. And it was so horrible that it made the national news and it made the international news, and the land was given back to the children. But land corruption happens all across Kenya all the time, and people get away with it, and it never, ever makes the news. So this was one story that was so bad that it did. The picture on the right is a picture of a house that's been burned down in Zimbabwe because Grace Mugabe, who is the ex-president's wife, wanted the whole village as her land. So they harassed the villagers, they burned their village down, and there was no media about it at all until Mugabe died and the family stopped being in power. And only then did the media feel they could actually put it in the news. Next slide. So what I found in all of my research and all of my work over the past 20 years is there are two strategies that really work to publicly shame elites. The first is to get good media coverage at the international level and the most national media coverage you can get while keeping national journalists safe. I have colleagues in Cameroon who very quietly have made very, very good relationships with international and national journalists. And the journalists trust them. They know they're always going to give them a good story. And they bring in those journalists very quietly. They don't go there themselves. They send the journalists with other people, and the journalists really cover it in national media and international media. And my colleague in Samuel in Cameroon, who does this work, he says that the most important thing is to make sure that the people who are the root investors and the shareholders and the board members get to read about what the people on the ground are doing, because often they don't know. So you need the journalists to show the people who have the power in their boardrooms in France or in England or in, Florida, the United States, wherever they are. You need the journalists to show them, like, what you're doing, here's what it is, and the whole world is going to know. Like, it's not a secret thing. And then the most important strategy is to do the research and find out who are the root investors behind the company. No company just has all the money itself. It has to raise the money from bigger investors. So if you're dealing with a corporation in Florida, it's highly unlikely that that corporation in Florida doesn't have financial backers. So you need to do the research to find the companies and the rich people who are giving that company its money, and give them a summary of what's happening. Write to them, send them videos, send them documentaries, send them media articles, and say, this is what your money is funding. The reason this works is that people are very worried about their images, and they're very wanting to show that they have corporate social responsibility. They don't want to be shamed on the global stage for land grabbing, for human rights abuses, for corruption, for burning down villages, for stealing land. And so if you can show them that that's what their money is funding, they will often pull their money away from the bad acting smaller business. It's also bad for business. There's a lot of data that's showing that when land owned by rural communities is granted to a company through corruption, the resulting conflicts with local communities result in actual financial losses for the corporations. that on average amount to anywhere between 8 million and 44 million US dollars. And just as a final note, there's a lot of good laws out there that can help you when you're talking to media or when you're talking to the root investors. There's a lot of United Nations conventions against corruption, Inter-American Convention against corruption. There's also the UK Bribery Act and the American Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And those are really strong pieces of legislation that you can use in efforts to shame and sway global actors. So that's the end of my presentation. And I hate to be the bearer of such bleak news. But the two strategies that I did describe at the end have worked and do work. And so I really hope that they might be something that you guys can try doing in Ecuador. So thank you. Muchas gracias.